bit of background on my name, it's Mair, if you can speak Welsh. If not, forget about it. Right. Good afternoon. I hope you're all enjoying the day and finding my fellow speakers' presentations as fascinating as I have. Truth be told, when I was asked to speak here today, I was a little bit intimidated to be speaking alongside some very smart people. Because I don't have a fancy doctorate, I don't even have a degree yet. I don't represent any organisation standing here in front of you today, and I'm not in charge of any services. But what I do have is an autism diagnosis, and I have diagnoses of depression, anxiety, anorexia nervosa, and psychosis. So we could argue that maybe I am the most qualified to speak here today. I started to feel different when I was about 6 years old. I noticed that my peers were in a different world to me, that I was in a different world to them, and that my fellow classmates could communicate in a way that I simply couldn't understand. And this left me with this uncomfortable, exposed feeling. And even at 6 years old, I knew that being different made me vulnerable. So I decided that I would learn to be normal, whatever that is. And I suppose in true autism form, I decided that I would also not include any other human beings in how I was feeling or the decisions that I made. I learned by watching other children. I observed their hand gestures, their body language, the words they used, the tone of voice, etc. And then I copied. And then as I grew and I became older, I became more able to be intelligent in the way I did this. And I could notice patterns, I could test hypotheses, and I could build diagrams and flowcharts in my head to help me navigate socialising. And it worked really, really well. No one really noticed that I was different. I did well in school, I had a good group of friends. And that, even though that was what I was aiming for at the time, it did come with a few side effects. I grew up thinking that I was a failure. I grew up thinking that my true self was a disgrace and was something that should be hidden away. It was 14 years old when the cracks began to appear. I started to feel quite low and got unusually anxious over certain things, but I actually just brushed it off, saying that it was just teenage angst, and I ignored what was happening in the hope that it would go away. But when I went into year 10, the beginning of GCSEs, things went downhill rather quickly. It reached the point where I was in the depths of depression. I felt as though I was sinking beneath an ocean, desperately trying to breathe, and the weight of water pushing me down. The anxiety I had was never ending, and I was constantly in a state of red alert. Having anxiety is a bit like when you're home alone and you hear a noise coming from the other side of the house. Thoughts start racing, your heart starts pumping, and this lump of fear and dread weighs down your ribcage and freezes your airways. For someone with anxiety, that feeling never stops. My appetite diminished and my ability to complete even simple tasks faded away. I couldn't sleep because my brain simply would not switch off. The only relief I found came from self-harm. Self-harm acted as a conversion between emotional pain and manageable physical pain. And all of this added upon the utter confusion and disorientation I had over how I was feeling and what was going on in my head. I was very lucky, and the school noticed very quickly that I needed specialist help and referred me to a primary mental health nurse. I think I saw the primary mental health nurse twice before he got scared and then referred me again on to more specialist help. I started seeing a psychiatrist and specialist CAMs every couple of weeks. I was very lucky that I wasn't put on a waiting list, and to this day I'm not sure why or how I managed to bypass the waiting lists. I wish I could share that secret with you, but I can't. I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety to begin with, but my psychiatrist noticed there was something underlying, something that could have been causing these problems. And he pursued an autism assessment. I was very lucky to be able to jump the queue on that as well for autism assessment, because in my local area, the waiting list for autism assessment is 7 years long. Yeah, I know. Don't get me started. I was diagnosed with autism when I was 15 years old. Getting a diagnosis explained to me why I'd felt so different. It helped me to realise that I was not a failure. It helped to explain why I found this world so overwhelming. Getting a diagnosis was the very first step in my journey to self-awareness. But by then, mental illness had its grasp on my life. I was put on a variety of different medications, none of which had the desired effect and some of which had an adverse effect. I had a course of CBT, which although helped somewhat, it wasn't nearly as impactful as was required. Over a year, I continued the descent. It got to the point I was having panic attacks daily in school and full, out-of-control meltdowns in the middle of school corridors. I spent most of my evenings sat in A&E because I'd self-harmed or was very suicidal. I started getting hallucinations. I heard voices that shouted derogatory comments at me, and I saw people who I genuinely believed were going to kill me or my family. I had no control and I was detaching from reality. It was decided that community CAMHS could no longer support me and I was hospitalised. I was actually in a psychiatric unit across the river from here in the Royal Maudsley Hospital, which is actually about 5 hours away from my home. I spent 3.5 months there before being transferred to a unit slightly close to home where I spent 3 weeks. Community CAMHS didn't react in the best way to my discharge, and I didn't see any professionals for about 6 to 8 weeks after I was discharged from hospital. I relapsed over the next 6 to 8 months and became engulfed in the bitter and cold world of anorexia nervosa. I was almost at the point of being put back in hospital when one day I had an epiphany-style moment when I collapsed on my bathroom floor. I realised I didn't want to live a life jumping from hospital to hospital. I didn't need to surrender myself to these illnesses which made my life hell. I didn't need to be in pain. From that point onwards, I pushed and fought for the things that I knew that would help me. Things like dialectical behaviour therapy, family therapy, and no medication. I worked hard to break free from the illnesses which ruled my life, and 2 years on I can stand in front of you here to tell my tale. We are all probably aware of the downfalls associated with CAMHS. Long waiting times, lack of access to right treatments, overuse of medications, lack of family involvement, lack of local inpatient facilities, changing staff, lack of communication between different services, poor resources and funding, etc., etc. I've experienced nearly all of these things and felt the impact these issues can have on someone who is already suffering. Effects like distrust and the inability to build therapeutic relationships with practitioners, not being able to feel safe or comfortable in the environment, disjointed support and having to repeat my story over and over and over again, having to go hundreds of miles for appropriate care, my family being treated like a problem rather than part of a solution. Living with a disability is hard. Living with a mental illness is hard. Getting help should be easy. I want to bring up at least one positive point about CAMHS, and that's how hard the staff work despite not having the resources necessary to do everything that is asked of them. It's easy to place blame on individuals when nothing seems to be going right, but I know how hard CAMHS, community CAMHS and hospital CAMHS have worked over the years to try and keep me safe and give me the right kind of help. The truth is, some things in this world are going to be more difficult for me. I will probably always walk the tightrope above the chasm of mental illness. I do need extra help with some things compared to other people. My autism brain is not compatible with a neurotypical world. To deny all of this would be foolish, and I'd be setting myself up for disappointment. But give me the right conditions, teach me the right things, help me build the right environment, and give me the right kind of help, and watch me thrive. I'm 19 years old, and so far I've contributed to Welsh Government's inquiry into the Children and Adolescent Mental Health Services, which led to an extra £7.6 million being ring-fenced for the service each year. I've done 2 current affairs programmes, which aired on Welsh national television, one of which won a BAFTA award and is shortlisted for the Celtic Film Festival. I've spoken at conferences, seminars and events of all shapes and sizes, and I've spoken about young people's mental health in the Welsh press on many occasions. I've co-written a report on the well-being of children and young people in Wales, and it's been widely endorsed, including by Welsh Government. I'm a trustee of a Wales-wide charity which supports over 1,000 people with serious mental illness and their families. I'm a research champion for Cardiff University's National Centre for Mental Health. and I've been commissioned to undertake research projects in my local county looking at the experience of people with autism in secondary education. I recently visited my old school, where I went through a lot of the dark times over the past few years. Seeing that place again, walking the same corridors, speaking to the people, made me realise how far I've come. I could be modest and say that it was nothing, that anyone could have done what I have done. But actually, I've worked hard to be where I am today. I kept taking steps forward when all I wanted to do was give up. I fought for myself, and I fought for all of the other young people in Wales in similar situations. I've opened up to thousands of people about my diagnoses, and I've faced stigma, misconceptions, stereotypes, and ignorance. I've faced things most of my peers couldn't even imagine, yet I've achieved more before the age of 20 than some people do in a lifetime. I am not ashamed to have autism. I am not ashamed to have had mental health problems. My autism makes me a driven, hardworking, passionate person. It means I have high standards and will complete anything that is asked of me at the highest standard possible. It makes me organised, honest, and authentic. Having been through mental health problems has taught me to appreciate the little things, like eating a bowl of cereal in the morning, the sound of the wind in the trees, and the ability to smile and be happy. I no longer see my differences as a failure on my behalf. I see them as a blessing. Don't lose hope when you feel that life is throwing too many obstacles in your face. Don't lose hope for your sons, daughters, siblings, friends, parents, clients. When the right conditions are eventually found, it will all have been worth it. Thank you.